Our Old Testament reading for February the 26th, 2023 comes from the second chapter of Genesis 15 through 17, and then chapter 3, verse 1 through 7. Genesis begins with the creation story. And then after the creation story, the creation of man becomes the focus of Genesis. And so in chapter 2, we have the creation of Adam to be the caretaker of the garden, to be the one whom God has charged, our first commandment, to care and maintain creation. And then a helpmate, a companion, an equal, bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, an equal in every way, is made for Adam, and that is Eve. And they can partake of anything in the garden. Notice we don't have indication of any killing or slaughtering or processing of meat, of animals. That happens after Noah, when a dispensation for the killing of animals to provide sustenance. But before that, we have vegetarians, eating of the fruits and the nuts and the milk and the eggs. And so we have Adam and Eve in harmony with all of creation. I myself have encountered a community, a silent retreat center, where all the animals seem to be in harmony with all the people that are there. It's something about being silent and being quiet and being contemplative, that the animals just regard you as one of many animals at that retreat site. And the deers will just walk in front of you. They're not tame, they're not pets, they're wild animals. But they don't view you as a threat. Adam and Eve enjoyed this in the garden, enjoyed this harmony and this innocence. In fact, some rabbis look at the story as the story of moving from an age of innocence through puberty to adulthood. And just as every child begins to learn more and more about their environment, and every child begins to challenge their parents, so Adam and Eve are faced with the option of challenging God. They can eat of everything except the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. There's nothing wrong with knowledge. What's wrong with partaking of the tree of knowledge is the assumption that once you partake of that knowledge, that you, like God, will be able to choose what is good and what is evil. In fact, you don't need God to tell you what's good and what's evil, because you can judge for yourself. And this assumes that we have the capacity to understand how everything is linked together. And there's a false assumption in this. And that is that knowledge is the same as wisdom. We can partake of the tree of knowledge, but wisdom is understanding how everything is interconnected and interrelated, and how one thing affects another, and to not understand the consequences of actions. God sees the whole woven history of humanity and creation. We see only a part through our mortal and limited perspective. And no matter how far we advance in science, we get to boundaries where we just don't know. A breakthrough is made and we go a little bit farther, but again we get to a point where we just don't know. We think we understand, and then later the environment social situations showed that there were unintended consequences of those actions. Actions we thought were good produce results of devastatingly evil things. By assuming that we can take the judgment seat from God, we are assuming the role of omniscience, all-knowing. This is where sin comes in. This is the original sin. To assume that we can judge what is good and what is evil. That we know better than God, or we know what is better for us than God knows. Just like a child challenges the authority of a parent. And this realization of what is good and what is evil, suddenly we begin to judge ourselves and the things around us. And so Adam and Eve looked on each other and discerned that they were different. And in their shame, they covered up what was different. Although God had created them that way, and God called everything good, and there's nothing to be ashamed of, and yet, in the realization that their bodies were different, they judged that difference to be something to be hidden from and ashamed of. Much as children who reach puberty and their bodies begin to change, become uncomfortable and shy with those changes. And so they hide from God. They hide from the one who knows them and has always known them, and the one from whom which you cannot hide, they try to hide from. And God, like a parent, wraps them in clothing for protection and says, it's time to leave. It's time to go out on your own. And at that point, the difference between male and female moves from an issue of shame to an issue of sexuality, to where they will be married and they will go and procreate. For a man shall leave his mother and his father and join with a woman, and she will suffer childbirth. And in order to support the family, he will toil in the soil to make his own way. Because if we know what's right and what's wrong, then we also have to live with the consequences rather than living in that created paradise, our Father's home. As rabbis have seen this story as a movement from childhood through puberty to adulthood, so we see the loss of innocence in every generation. And then we see, as that generation begins to have children, the struggles they have as they watch their children move from childhood to puberty to adulthood. And we begin to read Scripture differently. Read Scripture not through the eyes of a child, not through the eyes of an independent adult, but through the eyes of a parent who watches their child struggle through these levels, wanting the best for them, hoping for the best of them, and knowing that there are consequences to the actions they have chosen. And so we have the story of creation and that original sin. And the original sin is to say that you know or have the capacity to know as much as God. That you can judge what is good and evil from your limited perspective. That you, by your own strength, by your own wisdom, can stand. And that you don't need God. That original sin is the root of all other sins.